This episode is brought to you by California Almonds. Almonds are a great addition to any wellness routine. They're the perfect on-the-go snack, and only a handful of almonds is all you need to get the benefits. Like 50% of your recommended daily value of vitamin E, a powerful antioxidant that helps protect and keep your skin healthy. So no matter what wellness looks like to you, yoga, massages, listening to your favorite podcast, almonds are easy to bring along. Eat almonds. Live well. Repeat.
This episode on codependency is slated to come out on Valentine's Day. Is that on theme or maybe overplayed?
I was delighted to hear that you're doing a Valentine's Day episode on codependency. I feel like we all have a duty at this moment to not be spinning the same yarns about love. I also think codependency is having a moment on TikTok and elsewhere, and it's a great time to talk about actually what it is.
Unladylike. I've had enough.
This is Unladylike. I'm Cristen, and it's true. Like a lot of therapy speak these days, codependency is having a moment on TikTok.
Here is a hack to not live codependently, to not be codependent.
Codependency, it is this epidemic that's sort of everywhere but hard to identify.
Codependency really is just simply this. If you're good, I'm good. If you're not good, I'm not good. That's it.
That's it?
That's it.
Okay, well, I guess that's the end of the episode. Yeah, right. Unladies, that is not it, okay? The thing about codependency, I've learned, is that it's both very complex and pretty controversial. Some folks refer to it as love addiction or toxic monogamy. Codependency critics, meanwhile, call it a toxic myth. They say, oh, this was just invented by AA to propagate 12-step recovery programs and sell self-help books like the classic Codependency No More. But that doesn't make the underlying behaviors and patterns codependency describes any less real. In the 2018 study titled The Lived Experiences of Codependency, lead researcher Dr. Ingrid Bacon identified 3 hallmarks of self-identified codependence: a lack of clear sense of self, an enduring pattern of extreme emotional, relational, and occupational imbalance, and control issues stemming from childhood trauma. Which, to be fair, probably doesn't make for a great TikTok, okay? Codependency also is not a formalized diagnosis listed in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, or DSM, and despite decades of research, there is no universally accepted definition of what exactly codependency is. What we do know is that codependency is a self-help staple, which in and of itself is stigmatized. It also comes with a lot of gender baggage that today's guest has spent quite a bit of time unpacking.
My name is Nina Renata Aron. I'm a writer and editor. I'm the author of a memoir and cultural history of codependency called Good Morning, Destroyer of Men's Souls, a memoir of women, addiction, and love.
Now, to be clear, neither I nor Nina are therapists. And if there are psychologists or addiction recovery specialists who are listening to this and are like, hey, you didn't talk about this or you misinterpreted that, please, I am all ears. If you want to weigh in, send your emails and voice memos to hello@unladylike.co. And please know that I am doing my best to be as sensitive as possible, especially since this conversation delves into the realm of addiction. But for our unladylike purposes today, we're focusing in on the culturally fraught relationship between codependency, women, and feminism. In other words, I'm trying to stay in my lane, y'all.
It was really kind of denigrated for a long time because it is this very feminized, gendered set of behaviors. And so I've been kind of excited to see that right now on social media, it's speaking to people as a concept. I personally feel that codependency is kind of due for an upgrade. A lot of the tools were designed to keep women in heterosexual marriages. but so I think there's room for us to debate the merits of using that blanket term. But for me, it was life-saving as a framework for understanding my own behaviors. And I've seen it in a lot of places. I think there's just an explosion of kind of pop psychology and self-help on social media. And some of that is fraught because it's not underpinned by like great expertise, but it is motivated by people's desire to feel better and live better. And I think that's important.
So how did you first hear about codependency, and what did you think it was?
I first heard about it when I was a teenager, and I write a lot about this in my book, but my sister developed a heroin addiction when I was like a young teenager, and it had a profound effect on my family. And it was like about a decade of really harrowing, intense addiction and all of the fallout that comes from that. Al-Anon was recommended to me by a high school guidance counselor at the time because I was starting to not do well at school, and I was very distracted and had a lot of responsibility and emotional responsibility at home. So I tried Al-Anon, and my parents tried Al-Anon. And for anyone who doesn't know, that's the kind of sister program of Alcoholics Anonymous for friends and family of alcoholics and addicts. That was when I first heard the term, and I kind of understood it to be the province of old ladies. Like I went to a meeting in the 90s, and it was a lot of older women who had alcoholic husbands and who seemed to have figured out how to live with that. And it felt very Christian to me. I was raised Jewish, and it was my first time like in a church. I went to a church, and a lot of the values felt very Protestant. There was a kind of rigidity to it, and it was super interesting, but I just understood it as like getting your own act together. And I didn't really understand it in a more fine-grained way until much later. It kind of freaked me out.
Well, Nina, I have to tell you, I had codependency so wrong. I always thought that codependency was like the inverse of independence, right? And, I am a feminist. I value my autonomy, my independence, and I thought that basically disqualified me, from codependency or codependent behaviors. Do you think that that's a common misunderstanding?
Definitely. I think it's actually quite complicated, codependency, and I think people use the word as a kind of shorthand, and I don't always even understand what people mean when they say it because I don't think they necessarily know what it is. It's kind of like when someone just casually is like, I'm really OCD about my kitchen or something, and someone with OCD might be like, as someone who knows I have this thing, codependency, and has like had to unfortunately spend a lot of time understanding exactly what it is, I'm often like, let's not just call anything codependency. And I think people do see it as like an excess of dependency, which it is, but it's also, when you're in that kind of disordered relationship to someone and you do have an excessive focus on someone else, there is like too much dependency on that person. But on the flip side, like there's also a perverse kind of power and control that comes from managing a relationship to somebody else, managing someone else's life. And in the case of the romantic relationship I primarily write about in my book, I was really like a gatekeeper. I was running his life for a long time and keeping my own life really separate. So I was maintaining that independence, and that seems kind of paradoxical, but that was because I did all the work, I paid all the bills, I gave him the money he needed for drugs every day, and I made all the decisions. And there's also a real kind of self-abnegation and denial of self, because even though you keep yourself separate, it doesn't mean that you're in really deep touch with what you want or need. So a lot of what we do in codependency recovery is learn how to identify a gut feeling when someone's like, what's your gut telling you? And when you've grown up in the dysfunction of addiction, you're like, I don't have a gut. I don't know. I don't even know what that means. So that's been a huge part of my recovery, is like learning to check in with myself and figure out whether I have a feeling and what it is and how to name it and say what I need.
Could you talk a little bit more about that gut feeling disconnect in those kind of dysfunctional family systems growing up around addiction, why that disconnect happens?
My experience was pretty typical, where my sister developed this addiction, which was frankly terrifying and very unprecedented in my middle class Jewish household. My dad was a bit emotionally checked out about it, and my mom turned to me, the middle child. I became a kind of spouse. I went to check my sister into rehab with her instead of my dad. I was her point person, and I was the person who was close to my sister, who could be told to like go through my sister's bag or see if my sister was high at school, or, you know, do all this detective work. I resented that. I felt like I couldn't speak up about the fact that I resented that. But I was also really enlivened by that. That gave me like a sense of purpose, a sense of power. And it made me feel like that was my ticket to the most purest form of love from my mother. And when you are continually called upon to play that role, it becomes very hard to say, like, hey, today I know you're really worried about this, but I need help with homework or something. I think we just get farther and farther away from identifying our own needs, because the not to make everything a drug metaphor, but the purest hit of purpose and love comes from those other behaviors, being handling a crisis, you know, dealing with the high stakes stuff of addiction.
Could you share a little bit about sort of where you were at when the codependency light bulb really went off for you?
I chose a wildly unstable relationship with a person who was in the throes of extreme addiction to heroin and crack and other things. And I did that when I was married. I was a young mother, and this ex-boyfriend with whom I'd been madly in love as a teenager came back into my life, and I left my more stable, not totally stable life to be with him. So some part of me, I think, knew that like some little alarm bell was going off when I made that really pretty inadvisable decision. But it took me years in that relationship to really be brought to my knees. You're not necessarily going to lose your job because you're so codependent. You're not going to lose your house. Like, probably you're carrying all the responsibility for the household. What happens is you reach an emotional bottom that is, you know, in my case, suicidal depression and sense of chaos. Things were profoundly chaotic emotionally, psychologically, mentally. And I was angry and resentful and had no outlets for that. And I knew that I would continue to express that anger through self-defeating and self-harming behaviors. I was never going to say to my partner, like, here's exactly what I need, and if you can't do it, this relationship is over today. You know, I was just going to continue down my own path of self-destructive drinking or cheating or whatever. So I had to pull myself back from the edge. It's a kind of cliche of AA and Al-Anon that you like come in crawling. And for me, that was paradoxically not thinking I'm going to die. It was thinking I'm going to live. I'm going to be a grandma and be doing this kind of, feeling like this, that was horrifying.
Why use the language and framework of addiction in a relationship setting?
That's a really good question. I think it's the framework we have, and I think that it will continue to evolve. And my aim in writing this book was not just situating my experience and contextualizing my experience in like a longer women's history, which was really interesting and shed a lot of light on enabled me to not just be looking at my individual pathology, but understanding these behaviors as a very gendered response to very unequal power relations over time. But I also think that I wanted to pressure test codependency. Like, it's a great tool. The codependent dynamic that one experiences in a romantic relationship, it is quite similar to addiction. Like, you do develop a relationship to that person, and that person often is acting in ways that are abusive and unreliable and unpredictable. But, if my ex-boyfriend, didn't text me back or something, I would be in a state that's not unlike drug withdrawal, like totally fixated, obsessed, and physically having physical symptoms of, and I see people in those relationships, people in those relationships who are acting like they're fine, but that tether to that, it's not a substance, in this case it's a person, but it does look a lot like drug addiction. So part of me says, from personal experience, it is the right analogy. And also we have to keep updating these tools, because even our way of thinking about addiction and alcoholism has changed profoundly and must continue to change. And when I think about even the tone I take when I talk about these things, I'm like nearing middle age, and that shit is played out. I hear other people talking who've grown up with more of a harm reduction sensibility, and I hear myself sounding like a product of the 80s and 90s, which I am. And that was a time of real criminalization, marginalization, stigmatization of drug users, and shame. Like, it's all shrouded in shame. I defer to a younger generation on some of these things, and I hope to continue to evolve my own thinking. But I would like defend the addiction analogy, because I do think that's how you end up acting, and you debase yourself.
And ladies, I have a feeling that all of us are probably familiar with that feeling that our bodies are just one big medical mystery, I mean, who among us hasn't just texted the group to see what might be going on with our health? But you know what? We are extremely unlikely to find quality medical advice in our group chats, unless we're friends with a bunch of doctors. But you can find it from a doctor on ZocDoc. Thousands of medical professionals on ZocDoc are there to help you. They listen like a friend and give you the expert care you need. ZocDoc is the only free app that lets you find and book doctors who are patient-reviewed, take your insurance, are available when you need them, and treat almost every condition under the sun. No more doctor roulette or scouring the internet for questionable reviews. With ZocDoc, you have a trusted guide to connect you to your favorite doctor you haven't met yet. Millions of people use ZocDoc's free app to find and book a doctor in their neighborhood who is patient-reviewed and fits their needs and schedule just right. Go to ZocDoc.com/unladylike and download the ZocDoc app for free. Then find and book a top-rated doctor today. Many are available within 24 hours. That's ZocDoc.com/unladylike. ZocDoc.com/unladylike.
This episode is brought to you by California Almonds. Almonds are a great addition to any wellness routine. They're the perfect on-the-go snack, and only a handful of almonds is all you need to get the benefits. Like 50% of your recommended daily value of vitamin E, a powerful antioxidant that helps protect and keep your skin healthy. So no matter what wellness looks like to you, yoga, massages, listening to your favorite podcast, almonds are easy to bring along. Eat almonds. Live well. Repeat.
So let's get into the gendering of it all and the history that you uncovered. I've been so excited to talk to you about this. Is codependency a feminine condition?
Great question. Complicated question. I would argue yes. And part of why I wanted to write about it was because I had never read about it. And then I got really heavy into the historical research, and codependency as we understand it evolved largely out of the temperance movement in the 19th century, which evolved largely out of the Second Great Awakening, the Protestant revival toward the beginning of the 19th century. I did a lot of reading of temperance women's oratory, which was fiery and extremely badass. I thought these women were kind of prim Christians who wanted to ruin everybody's party and didn't want anyone to drink alcohol. But those men were drinking a colossal amount of alcohol throughout the 19th century in America, and women had no political or economic power. None. You couldn't divorce, you couldn't have your own job and support your kids. So the temperance movement was really this sort of gathering of energies to figure out how to deal with men's drinking. And the power that women did have was the power of what I read someone called moral suasion, the power, the moral high ground. And they kind of cultivated a whole rhetoric of shaming alcoholic men, but also speaking really frankly about their own suffering. And they became a political force that fed prohibition, which was arguably a totally failed experiment. But it's all super interesting. And when I read about the temperance and really read in their own voices how these women were talking, I was my mind was blown. I was oh, these are historically conditioned behaviors. Codependency could be easily thought of as just women being controlling or enabling or manipulating or something. But I was thinking they had to do that. They had to be a little wily because they had to live with this really unequal situation. And they ultimately petitioned for, they gained enough political power to change some of these laws around, grounds for filing for divorce, etc. But I came to sort of understand that was the groundwork, and it was totally gendered because it was not socially acceptable for women to drink at the time. There were not just it wasn't half women in the saloons, It was a men's problem, and women were responding to it. And that response was conditioned by gendered constraints of all kinds. And then the founding of Al-Anon followed the founding of AA in the 30s. And Al-Anon wasn't founded until 1951, but the very kind of medical understanding of alcoholism, it was like a dyad. There was the alcoholic and what was called the co-alcoholic, and then became the codependent. And so it was understood to be not just an individual disease, but a married couple's disease, or a mother and son. It's for every alcoholic, there's some lady crying about how he spent all the money or drank up all the, whatever. And so I think it's kind of baked into the way this term was defined and has developed over the years. And I think that's probably starting to change.
Going back to our timeline, codependency didn't go mainstream until the mid 80s when, it just became this self-help blockbuster. So which went more viral? Codependency in the 80s or gaslighting today?
That's a great parallel. I hadn't thought of that. Yeah, they're very similar. In the 80s, codependency had maybe its biggest moment, bigger than today. I think bigger than the TikTok moment.
I know, books. It was actually, if you can believe it, listeners, it was printed books that people were reading.
Those used to exist. Yeah. Yeah. And unfortunately, I think because it's a women's issue, and it's not, I should say, an officially recognized disorder in the DSM or something. It is kind of like a behavioral pattern. But I think it's been really understudied because it's chick stuff. And the 80s was the self-help boom. There's a famous book called Women Who Love Too Much, which isn't specifically about codependency. It's kind of about what we now call relationship addiction or love addiction. And now we also have all the tools of attachment theory that are also related. These are all in the same neighborhood. But that book, which I do really recommend. I reread it a couple of times while writing my book, and I did really see myself in that book. It's not a difficult read. It's like a breezy self-help book, but it's very helpful for anyone who's wondering whether they are putting too much focus on a man.
Yeah, there is a distinct heteronormativity to
Yes.
it all as well. And if you just look at the titles of some of those seminal books that came out in the 80s, because there's also, Codependent No More. I think I also had this initial reaction to seeing titles like Women Who Love Too Much that feels like, oh God, is this just a
Totally.
rom-com trope?
Yeah, I think that that's kind of what I'm saying is none of this had broken through out of the register of kind of frivolity. And the reason I wanted to write about it and do it in a literary way was to take it seriously. I have never seen it taken seriously. And in the rooms of Al-Anon and other recovery programs, obviously it's taken seriously as a kind of suffering and a kind of unhealthy, dysfunctional relationship pattern that we're trying to heal from. But it's still not taken that seriously. And I kind of wanted to find a way to put it in the realm of real consideration, literary and historical. And it's much more interesting than we've given it space to be.
What did you make of the feminist backlash to what I'll call big codependency, the codependency boom in the 80s and 90s?
I think that was a reaction toward a kind of characterization of a broad swath of the world's women as submissive, helpless, unable to do anything but live in the shadow of a big, powerful, scary man. And those people are completely right that that's not a way that we want to characterize women of the world. That said, I think it also kind of deepened the shame of women. I'm somebody who was raised by a brilliant feminist mother, and I've considered myself a feminist since I was 4 years old or something. I studied gender studies. I've spent my life really committed. I was a riot girl. I've done activism. I'm into it. And so I felt a lot of shame just seeing these patterns in my own life because they were at odds with another stereotype about feminists, and that they have to be strong and independent and that they don't need men and that, and so all of these depictions are reductive and they don't serve us. It's always more complicated. But I would say I totally understand why, after fighting so hard for the gains that feminists won through the 60s, 70s, 80s, to suddenly have this blockbuster bestseller about women being like enthralled to shitty guys and that being like our essential nature and what we can do to overcome this like kind of complex or something. I mean, I'm totally with those feminists who are like, what? But I also think we have to hold space for this really painful, complicated experience of codependency, or whatever you want to call it.
The self-care book that changed my life. Codependent no more.
So, okay, I have a big thought here, Nina. Culturally, we are in a time that feels very familiar to that that late 80s moment. We were in a conservative backlash full tilt, and am I just hearing things, or is there kind of an echo here?
There's definitely an echo. I mean, I think this was another reason why I wanted to kind of interrogate codependency, because it came out of these Christian movements, and their primary aim was to keep intact the heterosexual nuclear family. So it's easy to think that the overarching message in codependency recovery is like, take back your own life, whatever that may mean. But really, like the book that was written in 1950 something, the aim of it was stay with your alcoholic husband. It's like, you need to figure out how to sort yourself out so that you can stay and raise your children and be a good mother. And there are some passages I quote in my book that were particularly amusing to me, where it was like, the advice was to knead your anger into the bread dough, to garden your cares away. like take the anguish of this experience and make it productive. And I know
productivity culture, yes.
Yes. Yeah, use it to like make your home more beautiful or whatever. And to me, like, one big correction that is needed is to bust out of that. And, when we take our lives back and become like the main character of our lives again, when we recover from codependency, like, then we should use that freedom to do whatever serves us, whatever we want. And I think that's why I really understand a feminist backlash to it, because it was like, cooked up in a particular kitchen to get women to stay in that kitchen. And that's very similar to a conservative strain. Like we're almost back to the, moral majority kind of vibe of the 80s.
How do you contextualize codependency also within a more gender and sexuality inclusive framework? Because it was baked right into this very like cis normative framework, and also there is so much, it describes very gendered behavior and these very gendered roles that women are often raised to play out no matter what. Not to mention just like, oh my God, like all of we could have a whole other conversation about how all of our like pop cultural portrayals of love just like feed right into this. So is it only women then, cisgender women, who can be codependent? I'll put it that way.
I would say no, not at all. And I live in the Bay Area, and I am part of a pretty thriving recovery community that is probably half queer. I think that I have these conversations a lot with people, and it's similar in AA or other 12-step recovery contexts, because the tools we have are old. And I mean, I'm not a religious person at all, but it is akin to the way people read the Bible and have to find ways to read themselves into it, even though it was written so long ago and it was not written with them in mind. And I think that, the kind of foundational texts of Al-Anon and AA, it's a big part of recovery now to talk through the ways that we don't feel our experiences reflected there, and ways that this framework fits, and also ways that it feels totally anachronistic or wrong. So that's a very live conversation. But I think in terms of the relationship patterns, they can happen in any relationship, certainly, because I think they are gendered in a historical sense. And I also think they have to do with power, and they have to do with dysfunction. And, anyone can be the addict in this scenario, and anyone can be the codependent. I mean, I think literally everything is mediated by gendered thinking and expectations. But no, I mean, I've seen these patterns in every single conceivable kind of relationship.
Well, how would you describe your relationship to codependency today?
Good question. I think that understanding my own pain through the lens of codependency was profoundly life-changing. It allowed me to understand why I was doing the things I was doing. And I was making some very bad decisions in my life. They were not serving me, and I was in terrible pain. And codependency gave me a framework for understanding that. So I'm very grateful that the concept exists. That said, my relationship is one of kind of healthy, tolerant skepticism. Like, I love codependency, and I'm also the first one to be ready to talk about its problems. And I'm kind of skeptical of anyone who doesn't feel that way about anything. So I think it's just how I'm wired. I think we should always be thinking critically about these things. So I think understanding codependency may have saved my life, but I also hope that people keep talking about these patterns and behaviors and pushing our understanding of them forward so that we can kind of bust out of the container we were in, which was really just about staying married to a guy.
If there was one myth about codependency that you could bust, what would it be?
If I could bust one myth, it would be that the codependent is kind of helpless in the relationship. I think that I didn't actually understand my codependency, and I wasn't able to get past it until I understood how much power I was drawing from that relationship. And that power is very flimsy because it's not real. You're just like controlling and managing someone else's life. But I think that people are likely to see codependency as kind of just being subject to someone else's whims. But in fact, we find a lot of purpose and power there. And until we're ready to let that go, like really let go of trying to control someone else's, or believing that we can control somebody else's life or decisions, we'll never get better.
Unladies, do you have a relationship with codependency? Good, bad, indifferent? Let me know. hello@unladylike.co is the email address. You can also DM me on Instagram at Unladylike Media. And while you're at it, go ahead, follow at Unladylike Media on Instagram, Twitter, and TikTok. And thank you so very much to our guest, Nina Renata Aron. And be sure to check out her book, Good Morning, Destroyer of Men's Souls, a memoir of women, addiction, and love. You can also find Nina on Instagram and Twitter at Nina Renata Aron. If you appreciate Unladylike and want to help ensure its podcasting future, hashtag recession, hashtag inflation, please, please, please consider becoming an Unladylike patron. For $5 a month, you get a bonus episode every single week, instant access to the entire bonus archive, and more. Just $5 a month. $5, ladies and gentlemen, just $5 a month. That's patreon.com/unladylikemedia. Unladylike is a Starburns audio production, written, executive produced, and hosted by me, Cristen Conger. Aristotle Acevedo is our senior producer and engineer. Catherine Caligori is our associate producer. Our music is by Flamingo Shadow, Amit May Cohen, and Sarah Tudson. Until next week, what is the most unladylike thing about you?
The most unladylike thing about me is probably that I have the sense of humor of like a 12-year-old boy. So I find gross jokes and like boner humor really delightful. And to my great shame, that is not particularly ladylike.
I mean, who doesn't love a good fart joke? Come on.
Starburns Audio, a podcast network.